The Hannibal Directive was something that was developed in the 1980s by the Israelis to avoid situations where their enemies would capture 1 or 2 or 3 Israeli soldiers and then effectively hold them to ransom. An order was issued whereby they said, it's better that we kill everyone than allow people to be captured. At midday on October the 7th, it's reported the army revived the Hannibal Directive and applied it to civilians by Apache helicopter pilots, by anti-terrorism police units, and by the army as they entered the kibbutzes. You just have to look at the scale of the destruction, and it's clear that 1,200 men armed with rocket-propelled grenades and machine guns did not do all of this. It's pretty clear that in the chaos, hostages were hit by Apache helicopter fire. Within the kibbutzes, we've identified 18 people who were pretty much certainly killed by the police and the army as they arrived. 12 of them a specific incident in kibbutz Be'eri, where you have a large number of gunmen, around 40 gunmen, holed up in a house with 13 hostages. A tank is brought in and opens fire on the house. What's extraordinary is the Israelis were aware of the plans. Hamas were actually training quite openly for this operation, and they were actually placing the training videos online. On the very night of October the 7th, before dawn, spotters along the fence are reporting back to headquarters, and the head of Shin Bet and the head of military intelligence take this seriously enough that in the middle of the night, they're up and talking to each other. They conclude it's just another training exercise. They don't even raise the alert level to number 1. The most basic alert level would have made a huge difference. And they don't do that, which means that when Hamas bursts through the fence at 6:30 in the morning, they catch many of the defenders in their beds. You can see many of the soldiers are killed in their beds. Hamas had anticipated most of their fighters would be killed trying to get through the fence. In fact, only a small number were killed trying to get through the fence. They were as much taken by surprise as anyone by the performance of Israeli intelligence and the Israeli military. Crucially also, they were taken by surprise by this very large music festival that was taking place, which they don't seem to have been aware of. Having overrun the military bases, the game plan was to grab hostages and take them back. And they do this on a large scale, but they also clearly kill very large numbers of unarmed civilians as well. The peculiarity of the days after October 7 is that the Israeli media and subsequently the international media choose to focus not on the very real and extensive crimes that Hamas and others did commit, but on crimes they did not commit. And this had 2 focuses. In the days immediately after, it's to do with babies. The most dramatic one is we see an allegation that there were 40 babies killed, many of them beheaded. This is very simple to deal with because we have a comprehensive list of the dead. We know that 2 babies are killed on October the 7th. One is hit by a bullet fired through a safe room door. The other is a child who dies after an emergency cesarean. Now, any story about babies that does not relate to those 2, and there are a lot of stories about babies, is not true. We know it's not true. The Israelis have this strange system where they farm out the collection of bodies after disasters and terrorist attacks and so on to an organization called Zaka, who are ultra-Orthodox religious volunteers. They collect the bodies, prepare them for religious burial and so on. A character that many people will have seen in the days afterwards is Yossi Landau, who was the southern commander of Zaka, who was on television a great deal. He said,
piles of 10 children each were tied to the back, burned to death.
You then see a phone call which Netanyahu makes to President Biden, where he repeats this story. In fact, he embellishes it.
They took dozens of children, bound them up, burned them, and executed them.
Terribly important, this, because it was entirely untrue. We know the house he's talking about. He's talking about the house in Kibbutz Be'eri, which was the house that was stormed by Israeli police and military, and where it is almost certain that all of the hostages were killed by the Israeli police and military. There were 2 children there, 2 twins, but no other children, so we know the story is untrue. Mr. Landau told a number of other stories. There's one particularly notorious one about the fetus being cut out of a pregnant woman.
The baby that was connected to the cord was stabbed, and she was shot in the back.
We simply know this is untrue. The list of the dead show there's no such victim. Mr. Landau said, I have a picture of this atrocity.
If you want to see the picture, I have the picture of it.
This is the baby.
I'm sorry to be graphic here, but I can't see a baby here.
You can't see the baby but this is the picture of the mother.
It was a piece of charred flesh. It certainly wasn't a baby. So it was interesting. Psychologically, I'm not quite sure why he offered to show me a photo that he didn't have. I'd point out as well that Zaka was an organization that was in trouble. There had been a major scandal. Its founder had been accused of child sexual abuse. There was a financial scandal. It had been found to be cooking the books. It's raised an awful lot of money since October the 7th. These stories were clearly useful, and they were useful to the Israeli government. In the film, we see Benjamin Netanyahu visiting Zaka volunteers and thanking them for talking to the world's media and stressing that this is another front in the war. Why does this matter? Why does it matter whether this type of atrocity was committed, but not that type? People were killed in this way, not that way. It matters because the murder of babies and widespread rape has a particular resonance. It's particularly triggering. The Israeli government and its supporters, when they justify the brutality of the subsequent bombardment and invasion of the Gaza Strip, again and again and again, what they always reference is babies and rape.
Young girls who were raped and then murdered.
Women brutally raped and murdered.
Little kids who are beheaded.
Pictures of terrorists beheading children.
These bastards put these babies in an oven and put on the oven.
This is something you see in previous conflicts as well. If you want to dehumanize an enemy, if you want to desensitize people to the suffering that is inflicted on that enemy, then you portray them as barbarians, basically as savages, as people who are not deserving of humane treatment. And that's why it's relevant. That's why it's important to pick apart. A lot of the world's leading media outlets have done in-depth investigations where they have concluded there was widespread, systematic, instrumentalized, weaponized rape. The New York Times makes a particular feature of the story of a young woman. She was killed early in the morning at 9 miles north of the music festival site as she and her husband were fleeing. The New York Times, in its big December investigation into sexual violence, leads with this, and about a third of the article consists of her story. And it's immediately undermined because the woman's sister then posts on Instagram immediately afterwards, this isn't true, we know she wasn't raped. She was texting us until minutes before her death. It's also the case that her husband had a lengthy phone conversation immediately after her death with his brother, and again made no mention of rape. So it's very important that, because it's the central, most compelling piece of information in one of the biggest investigations done by one of the world's most prestigious media outlets, the New York Times, and it turns out not to be true. So no babies were beheaded, no babies were thrown into ovens, and there is no real evidence for widespread and systematic rape. Now, it's very clear why the Israelis might want these stories to circulate. What's less clear is why very reputable Western news and media outlets should swallow them so uncritically, particularly given the track record of the Israeli government and the IDF, which has been shown again and again and again in the past to have been less than truthful in the accounts it gives of things. The response to our film, October the 7th, by the I Unit at Al Jazeera has been interesting. The response is not to criticize and to pick apart and say we've got it wrong. They don't do that at all. What they do is they simply ignore you, which on one level I take as a compliment, because I think there are all sorts of people out there who would very much like to pick apart what we're doing and to destroy it and discredit it. And I think they take one look at it and decide they can't really do it. So what they do, which in a way is even more damaging, is just to entirely ignore us. So in a way, the treatment of this in many ways echoes the treatment of our earlier series, The Labour Files, which offered a critique of the dominant media narrative about Corbyn and the Corbyn years on the anti-Semitism crisis. They simply don't talk about it at all. In fact, episode 2 of The Labour Files on anti-Semitism, there has not been a single complaint against it, which is really quite remarkable given how contentious that issue is. What they do is they wield a far more powerful and effective weapon, which is to simply ignore it and silence it. To a degree, the same thing is happening with this one. You have people who run organizations like the BBC and so on, who still tend to think that just because, there's been no article about it in the Observer or the New York Times or whatever, that no one knows about it. In this social media era, something can be entirely ignored by traditional media, but very large numbers of people can still be aware of it. And I think that's what happens. This whole thing is a case study in the importance of alternative media and in the importance of social media as a way of transmitting those alternative voices. The events of October the 7th are a case study in how traditional media can let us down and how we desperately need alternative voices that will genuinely probe these things and not simply accept the narratives that are fed to them. for this reason, I think it's enormously important to have outlets like Double Down News, and I would urge you to support Double Down News in any way you can.